Hello everybody. In this video, I am going to talk about diffusion of respiratory gases, or the simpler term, gas exchange. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to describe the diffusion of respiratory gases in lungs and tissues. In this lecture, we are going to learn about respiratory membrane, partial pressures of respiratory gases, factors that influence the rate of diffusion, pulmonary diffusion capacity, red blood cell transit time, and the two types of gas exchange limitation, which are diffusion limited and perfusion limited. So when we talk about gas exchange, there are four questions that we need to answer. What, as in what gases are being exchanged, where does it occur, why it occurs, and how does the gas exchange process occur. So let's answer the first question, what? The two most important gases in our body is, of course, oxygen and carbon dioxide. Oxygen is needed for tissue metabolism, while carbon dioxide is produced from the metabolism. So oxygen from atmospheric air is inhaled into the lungs until it reaches the alveoli. And vice versa, carbon dioxide from the tissues is transported to the lungs and will be exhaled. So gas exchange involves these two important gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. The second question that we need to answer is, where do gas exchange process occur? So the answer is at the respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane is also called alveolar capillary membrane. It is a membrane that separates air within the alveoli from the blood within pulmonary capillaries. It consists of alveolar wall or alveolar epithelial layer, capillary wall or capillary endothelial layer, and their basement membrane. Epithelial basement membrane and capillary basement membrane. And in between those membranes, there is interstitial space. So the respiratory membrane is very thin, which is less than 0.5 millimeter. So this is another figure of respiratory membrane. This is the alveolar and this is pulmonary capillaries. So when deoxygenated blood from the pulmonary capillaries reaches the respiratory membrane, the carbon dioxide in the blood will diffuse into the alveolar from the capillary, whereas oxygen from the alveolar will diffuse into the pulmonary capillaries. So this newly deoxygenated blood will be transported to the tissues via circulation. So we have looked at where the gas exchange process occur. Now we need to understand, why do gas exchange process occur? The answer relies in the difference in partial pressure of the respiratory gases. Difference here refer to difference of partial pressure in the alveolar and partial pressure in the pulmonary capillaries. So, what is partial pressure? For this, we need to understand Dalton's law of partial pressure. So, according to Dalton's law, the total pressure exerted by a mixture of gases is the sum of the pressures exerted individually by each gas in the mixture. So, total pressure is equal to partial pressure of gas 1 plus partial pressure of gas 2 plus partial pressure of gas 3 and etc. So partial pressure of gas A, partial pressure of gas B and partial pressure of gas C, when all three combine to make a mixture that contributes to the total pressure. So, the partial pressure exerted by a gas is also directly proportional to its percentage in the mixture. For example, in this container, it contains a mixture of oxygen and nitrogen, which with total pressure of 752 mm². If this mixture contains 21.1% of oxygen and 78.9% of nitrogen, what is the partial pressure of each of these individual gases? So let us calculate. So 21.1% times the total pressure, which is 752 mm², is equal to 159 mm². So the partial pressure of oxygen in this mixture is 159 mm². Whereas for nitrogen, 78.9% nitrogen times 752 mm² is equal to 593 mm². So in this container with total pressure of 752 mm², the partial pressure of oxygen is 159 mm² and nitrogen is 593 mm². So this is Dalton's law of partial pressure. Now we have understood the concept of partial pressure. Let us take a look into the partial pressure of respiratory gases in atmosphere, trachea, and alveoli. The atmospheric pressure, or also called barometric pressure, at sea level is 760 mm². The partial pressure of oxygen is 159 mm², whereas partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 0.3 mm². But across textbooks, you may find that this number may be slightly different. For example, there are textbooks that use partial pressure of oxygen as 160 mm². But that's okay because it is only slightly different. It depends on which textbooks you use. But throughout this lecture, I am going to use 159 mm² as partial pressure of oxygen. So these are the atmospheric pressure. But once the air is inhaled into the lungs, this partial pressure will change. Remember, your respiratory passages contains fluids or surfactant. This surfactant will humidify the air that we breathe. So in the trachea, the partial pressure of oxygen reduces to 159.3 mm². The partial pressure of carbon dioxide remains the same, whereas water vapor pressure is increased to 47 mm². So this humidification causes a reduction of partial pressure of oxygen. And further, when the air reaches the alveoli, the partial pressure again changes. The partial pressure of oxygen further reduced to 100 mm². Partial pressure of carbon dioxide increased to 40 mm², and the total pressure remains the same at 760 mm². There are four reasons why the alveolar gas pressures differs from atmospheric gas pressures. The first reason is because alveolar air is only partially replaced by atmospheric air with each breath. The second reason, dry atmospheric air that enters the respiratory passages is humidified before it reaches the alveoli. And the third reason, oxygen is constantly being absorbed into the pulmonary capillaries from the alveolar. And the fourth reason is because carbon dioxide is constantly diffusing from the pulmonary capillaries into the alveolar. So these are the four reasons why alveolar air pressures is different from atmospheric pressures. So in the alveoli, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40 mm mercury, whereas partial pressure of oxygen is 100 mm mercury. In the pulmonary capillary, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 46 mm mercury, whereas partial pressure of oxygen is 40 mm mercury. Remember that this is deoxygenated blood. So because of this partial pressure difference, the gas will tend to move from higher pressure to the lower pressure. So carbon dioxide will diffuse from alveoli into the pulmonary capillary, whereas carbon dioxide will diffuse from pulmonary capillary into the alveoli. So this oxygenated blood will be transported via arterial circulation to the tissues. In the tissues, because of aerobic respiration, the partial pressure of oxygen is less or equal to 40 mm mercury, whereas partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 46 mm mercury. So because of this partial pressure difference, the gas will diffuse. Oxygen will diffuse from the blood into the tissues, whereas carbon dioxide will diffuse from the tissues back into the circulation. So this deoxygenated blood will be transported via venous circulation back to the lungs. And when the blood reaches the respiratory membrane, the gas exchange process will occur again. Now we have understand why gas exchange process occur. Now the last question that we need to answer is how. How the gas exchange process occur? Well, you guessed it, it is via a passive process called diffusion. So gas will diffuse from high pressure gradient to low pressure gradient. Recall the process that occurs at the respiratory membrane. The oxygen diffuses from alveoli into the capillary, whereas carbon dioxide diffuse from capillary into the alveoli. So according to Fick's law, diffusion rate, D, is proportional to partial pressure difference. This partial pressure difference refers to partial pressure in the alveolar and partial pressure in the capillary. The higher the difference, the diffusion rate will increase. Diffusion rate is also proportional to the cross-sectional area or surface area of the respiratory membrane. The larger the surface area, the higher is the diffusion rate. And diffusion rate is also proportional to the solubility, meaning the higher the solubility is, the higher is the diffusion rate. The diffusion rate is inversely proportional to distance of diffusion. This refers to the thickness of the membrane. If the membrane is thicker, the diffusion rate will decrease. Diffusion rate is also inversely proportional to the molecular weight or the size of the gas, meaning if the gas or the molecular weight is bigger, the diffusion rate will reduce. So these are the factors that contribute that determine the diffusion rate. Remember this equation. So across textbook, there may be other format that this equation is represented. You may encounter this equation, but it is actually similar to the equation. The factors are the same. Vx is also commonly used. This Vx represented the volume of gas transferred per unit time, which is equal to diffusion rate. So from this equation, there are four important factors that determine diffusion rate. The first factor is difference in partial pressure. At high altitude, barometric pressure is reduced. Therefore, the difference in partial pressure in the alveoli and capillary will also be reduced, causing diffusion rate to be reduced. Same goes in room with low partial pressure of oxygen. The partial pressure difference in the alveoli and capillary is reduced, causing diffusion rate is also to be reduced. The second factor is surface area of the respiratory membrane. Larger surface area resulted in higher diffusion rate. For example, during exercise, capillaries will be dilated. So, in other words, the surface area for gas exchange has become larger. This resulted in increased diffusion rate. In the case of emphysema or collapsed lung, the surface area is decreased. Therefore, diffusion rate is also decreased. The third factor is diffusion coefficient of a gas. It depends on the solubility and molecular weight or size of the gas. Increased solubility corresponds to higher diffusion rate, whereas increase in size corresponds to lower diffusion rate. The diffusion coefficient of carbon dioxide is about 20 times higher than oxygen. So if the two gases have the same partial pressure, carbon dioxide will diffuse 20 times faster than oxygen. The final factor is thickness of the blood-gas barrier or the respiratory membrane. This correlates to distance of diffusion, which is inversely proportional with diffusion rate. The thicker the barrier, or the further the distance, the diffusion rate will be decreased. For example, in the case of pulmonary edema, the interstitial space at the respiratory membrane has become thicker and filled with fluid, thus causing diffusion rate to decrease. Same goes in the case of pneumonia. In pulmonary fibrosis, the alveolar epithelial layer is damaged, scarred, and thickened, this causing diffusion rate to decrease. So these are the four important factors that determine diffusion rate. One is difference in partial pressure, surface area of the respiratory membrane, diffusion coefficient of a gas, and thickness of the respiratory membrane. Based from these four factors, we can determine pulmonary diffusion capacity. This is used to measure how efficient diffusion capacity in somebody's lungs, whether there is any disease or abnormality or not. So pulmonary diffusing capacity, or DL, for a given gas is the volume of gas in milliliter diffuses through respiratory membrane in each minute with 1 mm mercury difference in partial pressure. So the unit for DL is milliliter per minute per millimeter. So pulmonary diffusion capacity, or DL, can be measured using carbon monoxide. The reasons for choosing carbon monoxide instead of other gases such as oxygen or carbon dioxide is because carbon dioxide follows the same route as oxygen. That is the first reason. The second reason is because the partial pressure of carbon monoxide in the alveoli can be measured. And the third reason is because it has high affinity to hemoglobin. And the last reason is because partial pressure of carbon monoxide in the pulmonary capillary is very small or negligible. In pulmonary capillary, the partial pressure of oxygen is 40 mm mercury, whereas partial pressure of carbon monoxide is carbon dioxide is 46 mm mercury. So therefore, oxygen and carbon dioxide cannot be used to measure DL. Same goes in the case of affinity to hemoglobin. The affinity of hemoglobin towards carbon monoxide is bigger or higher than the affinity towards oxygen. So these are the reasons why carbon monoxide is chosen. So to measure DL, the subject will be asked to breathe a gas mixture containing 0.3% carbon monoxide, which is very low concentration of carbon monoxide. So one deep breath, the subject will be asked to hold the breath for 10 seconds. So the rate of carbon monoxide disappearance from the gas mixture is proportional to DL. So DLCO in young men at rest is about 17 milliliter per 1 minute per 1 millimeter mercury. So as diffusion coefficient of oxygen is 1.2 times than carbon monoxide. So diffusion capacity of oxygen is DLCO 17 times 1.23. So diffusion capacity of oxygen is 21 milliliter per minute per 1 per millimeter mercury. This is for young men at rest. So if there is increase or decrease in DLCO, we may be able to suspect the diseases or, for example, in emphysema, DL is decreased because there is destruction of alveoli, which results in a decreased membrane surface area. In fibrosis or pulmonary edema, DL also decreased because of increase in diffusion distance. DL may also be decreased in pulmonary hypertension and anemia. On the other hand, DL may increase due to exercise, supine position, asthma, pulmonary hemorrhage, polycythemia, mild left heart failure. So there may be other reasons or conditions that increase or decrease DL. So we can determine the condition based on the changes in DL.